They called him selfish, a fool for taking in 5 street kids when his health was failing. Whispers spread through the city. How could a dying millionaire devote his last days to children no one wanted? Yet behind the harsh judgment was a story no one expected. A bond that refused to break even under the weight of doubt. What truly happened in those final moments? If this story pulls at something deep in you, stay with us. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a thought. It means more than you think. The chandeliers at the Peninsula Chicago glowed like a constellation in glass. Beneath them, a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns flowed with practiced grace, every glance calculated, every handshake loaded with subtle stakes. It was a fundraiser for urban development. But what really developed in those halls were reputations. Gregory Caldwell arrived late. People noticed, not just because of who he was, a billionaire without heirs, a man whose name sat on buildings and university wings, but because of who walked in behind him. 5 kids, 5 awkward, too small for these ceilings, too young for these tables kids. They weren't dressed expensively, just carefully, shoes polished, shirts tucked, hair brushed. Their eyes darted, their hands stayed close to their sides, but they held formation tight, like they'd walked into a fire before. Jaden, the tallest, walked just a half step behind Gregory, scanning the room with a look too focused for his age. Beside him were the twins, Marco and Mateo, practically mirroring each other in the way they held their shoulders. Elijah lagged just a step. His gaze caught on the art hung across the foyer. And Noah, the smallest, clung to Gregory's hand, like he was still deciding if this place was safe. The reaction was immediate, but quiet. This wasn't a room that booed or barked. This was a room that whispered, and the whispers were razor sharp. Adopting or auditioning, someone murmured near the Perrier-Jouet station. He must be dying. No one does charity with this much theater unless they're folding their cards. A woman with lips too tight and a dress too tight leaned toward a man with slicked back hair. I guess this is his final PR stunt. Gregory didn't flinch. He rarely did. But the tension in his jaw shifted slightly as he guided the kids toward the long banquet table reserved for his name. It might have ended there, a spectacle, a footnote in the night's pageantry, if not for the man 3 seats down. Carson Leary, CEO of a hedge fund specializing in tax arbitrage and arrogance, lifted his glass and spoke too loudly. Gregory, you're diversifying portfolios now, emotional assets, high risk, low return. Jaden stood. It was smooth, instinctive, like the remark had pulled a string in his spine. He didn't glance at Gregory. He just turned to Carson and said, calmly, "Actually, sir, emotionally resilient systems often outperform traditional ones, especially when the market penalizes short-term thinking. You'd know that if you studied the 2008 recovery curves." There was a pause. Carson blinked. Someone at the next table choked on their drink. Elijah bit back a grin. Noah just looked up at Jaden like he always knew he could do that. Gregory didn't smile, but he did shift just slightly so that the hand holding Noah's curled tighter. Protective, proud, or maybe just present. The conversation resumed, but something had changed. Not in the room, those kinds of rooms take years to change, but in the orbit around that table. People looked longer, said less, measured more. Later. As the dinner wound down and the stage crew began clearing for the next panel, a photographer from the Tribune lingered near the edge of the ballroom. She raised her lens, focusing not on the headliners or the sponsor backdrop, but on a quiet moment. Gregory, seated with one arm behind Noah, listening as Elijah explained something with hand gestures too big for his frame. The flash went off once, and through her viewfinder, she caught it the way Gregory's eyes softened when Noah leaned into him. The way the boy rested against his side, like it wasn't a billionaire he sat with, but someone who remembered how to hold still for others. She didn't know the headline yet, but she knew she'd keep that shot. He didn't look up, but the moment had already left its mark. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. Morning cast a blue light over the windows of Caldwell Capital's top floor. Outside, Chicago was waking up in its usual rhythm, early traffic humming below, white breath rising from street vents, winter sun refusing to warm anything. But inside Gregory Caldwell's private office, time felt different, slower, thicker, like something had cracked and the air hadn't caught up yet. He sat at the long walnut desk with his back straight, as if posture could will away the weight of the envelope in front of him. He didn't open it again. Once was enough. Diagnosis, stage Y4, pancreatic cancer, metastasized. Prognosis, 3 to 6 months, with treatment. The words had lost all meaning, flattened into logistics, appointments, specialists, decisions. Celeste, his executive assistant for over a decade, entered without knocking. She always did when the news was bad enough to cancel etiquette. They sent over the asset transition list, she said, placing a thick folder on the desk. Legals recommending starting with the board. Then personal holdings. Foundations last. Gregory didn't look up. His hand rested lightly over the sealed envelope, thumb tapping once, twice. "Do you know where the boys are tonight?" he asked quietly. Celeste paused, just slightly. "Uptown. That apartment near Wilson. You approved the lease." He nodded once. She waited, expecting more. He said nothing. On the other side of the city, in a fourth-floor walk-up above a laundromat, the apartment was alive with its own rhythm. Jaden sat cross-legged on the floor, reading from a printed copy of a market cycle white paper Gregory had passed to him after the gala. He underlined in red, circled in blue. His lips moved silently. A legal pad sat beside him, half-filled, in the corner. Marco and Matteo knelt over a half-assembled 3D printer, salvaged from school supply rejects and Craigslist parts. Marco tweaked the extruder, while Matteo soldered a stripped wire with the calm precision of someone who learned mechanics before he learned grammar. Elijah sprawled on his stomach, sketching a human liver in colored pencil, pausing every few minutes to reference a medical anatomy book, also donated, also outdated, but handled like gold. Across the room, Noah sat on the sofa with a biology text twice his size. He wasn't reading line by line. He scanned pages like a machine, then closed his eyes and recited facts under his breath. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. They were used to moving around each other in tight spaces, used to being quiet when the world didn't listen anyway. Back at Caldwell Capital, Gregory stood and walked to the window. The city looked endless from up here. He used to find comfort in that, the blur of motion, the vertical ambition of it all. But now, it just felt far. His fingers tapped against the glass once. 5 kids, he murmured, barely audible. 5 minds, 5 stories. He turned away. In the hallway, Celeste passed the fax machine just as it beeped. She stopped. An auto-transmit line from Northwestern Memorial Hospital was coming through. Not routine. The hospital never faxed unless something urgent bypassed digital logs. She leaned down, brows already creased. It read, reassessment advised. Current treatment plan may omit key variant. Potential error flagged in systemic markers. Recommend full panel review. No additional details. No doctor's signature. Just a timestamp and a paper trail. She folded the page neatly and slipped it into her folder. Her expression didn't change, but her pace quickened. Later that evening, Gregory returned to his brownstone. The staff had already cleared out. He walked into the study, not turning on the lights, and sat down in the armchair near the fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. He pulled a slim notebook from the side table drawer. It wasn't marked. But inside, page by page, were profiles, photos, dates, observations. Marco and Matteo listed as mirror process thinkers. Elijah flagged for spatial intelligence beyond percentile norms. Noah marked simply memory retention, unconfirmed extreme. And Jaden, at the top, emotional resilient leadership, defensive, trust threshold low. He'd watched them long before they knew him, long before he'd walked into that shelter with a lawyer and a quiet question. He didn't adopt them for show. He chose them because something in them refused to be wasted. And now time was running out. Or maybe, just maybe, time was rearranging itself. He sat for a long while, holding the notebook in one hand and the fax page in the other. Outside, a siren passed, then faded. Inside, Something shifted in the silence. He didn't move, but something in him had started to. The boardroom on the 36th floor of Caldwell Capital wasn't built for children. Everything about it, the polished oak table, the panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the curated silence between lines of conversation signaled power and exclusion. Gregory walked in first. The 5 boys followed, single file. No one said anything at first. But silence in a room like that always had weight. Behind every nod was a glance. Behind every glance, a calculation. Preston Vale sat at the far end, already tapping a Mont Blanc pen against the corner of his tablet. He didn't rise, just watched. Jaden noticed the flick of his eyes once at the kids, once at Gregory, then back to the screen. Preston leaned over to a board member next to him. Is this his new executive team? He muttered, not loud, but not quiet enough. The meeting was called to discuss the firm's upcoming strategic pivot, Gregory's push for a social reinvestment model. Risky, radical, human-centered. It wasn't popular. Gregory took his seat without ceremony and gestured for the boys to sit in the row of chairs behind him. Marco clutched a small tool case he'd brought to show the prototype he and Matteo had built. It was basic an AI-driven calibration sensor for low-cost 3D printers. They had coded it from scratch over the weekend. Gregory believed it deserved a hearing, but before he could speak, Marco's fingers slipped. The metal case hit the floor with a clang. Heads turned. Preston's voice cut through. If this is the future of Caldwell Capital, I'd rather liquidate now. A few people chuckled. Matteo moved to help his brother pick up the scattered tools, but Marco waved him off. He didn't speak, just gathered everything quickly, chest tight. Gregory stood. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. You know what scares old money, he said. New intelligence it doesn't understand. Preston leaned back, smiling with too many teeth. What scares me is sentimentality dressed up as strategy. You'd be amazed, Gregory said. How many bottom lines have been saved by what you call sentiment? The room split in half, silently. Some looked away. Others studied Gregory with a different kind of attention. The boys remained quiet, watching the back and forth like a tennis match where none of them were supposed to be holding the racket. The rest of the meeting moved forward metrics, trends, votes, delayed for further review. Business carried on, but the fault line had been drawn. Afterward, as the room emptied. Matteo bent down to retrieve the final wrench from under the table. His fingers trembled. Gregory waited, letting the moment settle. I didn't mean to mess it up, Matteo mumbled. We just wanted to show it worked. Gregory crouched beside him, resting a hand on the edge of the table. You didn't mess anything up. But they laughed. They did. And you still picked everything up. Matteo didn't respond. Gregory reached over and closed the tool case. You didn't ask to be here. Neither did I. Once. But since we are... Let's stay a little longer. In the hallway, Jaden stood near the elevator, arms crossed. He didn't look angry, just sharper around the eyes. Preston's not afraid of failure, he said. He's afraid we won't need him when we succeed. Gregory smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then let's make him very afraid. Across the city, in a corner office belonging to Veil Private Holdings. Preston removed his cufflinks and checked his phone. One message waited from a contact labeled Westline Internal. The message read, "They're inside now. Shall I move?" Preston typed 3 words. Start the pressure. He slipped the phone into his pocket, straightened his tie, and stared out over the skyline like it still owed him something. And somewhere beneath that calm, something had already been set in motion. The building was quieter than usual that night. It was late, well past the hour when most lights downtown went dark, but Caldwell Capital's archive servers still hummed on the 11th floor. Gregory stood alone in the data room, the fluorescent light washing his face, a soft, pale blue. A cursor blinked on the screen in front of him, waiting for him to confirm the file's restoration. But his eyes were not on the screen. They were staring through it. Earlier that afternoon, Jaden had asked Celeste for access to Gregory's old philanthropic reports. It wasn't framed as suspicion, just curiosity. He had said he wanted to understand the structure of the Caldwell Trust. But what he found didn't require much digging. The document was plain, a single-page denial. Request rejected due to insufficient long-term impact forecast. The applicant, Westline Youth Housing Initiative. Underneath it, in faint type, a handwritten comment, non-scalable. Not a strategic fit. Signed G. Caldwell. Westline wasn't just another applicant. It was the shelter Jaden had grown up in. The same place where Marco and Mateo first met. The place Elijah had come back to after 2 failed placements. And now, years later, it turned out the man who had taken them in had also turned them away. Jaden didn't confront Gregory. He didn't storm in or accuse. He simply printed the file and slid it into a book Gregory had once given him, an early edition of The Intelligent Investor, and left it on the edge of the study table that night. Gregory found it just before midnight. He read the paper twice, then sat down heavily in the chair by the bookshelf. He didn't make excuses. He didn't mutter regrets. He just stared. In the adjacent room, dimly lit by a reading lamp, Jaden sat on the floor, back to the wall, pretending to study. He had done this often as a kid, waited for disappointment without announcing it, but this time it felt different. The silence wasn't hollow. It held weight. Gregory came to the doorway. He didn't step in, just stood with the folder in his hand. "I've signed a lot of papers," he said quietly. "Too many without thinking twice." Jaden didn't look up. "You thought twice about that one." Gregory didn't argue. There was a pause, then a truth. "I didn't know you were in that building." Jaden finally raised his eyes. "That's the point, isn't it?" Gregory didn't nod, but his breath caught. That night, while the boys slept, Gregory returned to the 11th floor, alone. He opened the digital vault and typed in the document code. Westline grant declined. Then he moved his cursor to a small button at the bottom of the screen labeled Restore to Archive. He clicked it. The file reappeared in the active database. A small act, a quiet act, but one that meant the past would not stay buried in silence. In the morning, Jaden found the book returned to his spot on the floor. The paper inside was gone. In its place, a note scribbled in an old man's handwriting, simple, unpolished. "You deserved better than a signature. I'm sorry you had to wait this long." He folded the page once, then again. He didn't throw it away. He didn't smile, but the weight in his chest began to shift. The air that afternoon carried a sharp edge, the kind of cold that didn't just brush skin, it stayed, clung. Gregory pulled his collar tighter as he walked alongside Mateo and Marco toward the design and biomechanics wing at Northwestern University. He could have sent someone, of course, but this, he'd told Celeste, was better done in person. "They need to be in the room," he'd said. What he didn't add was that he needed to be there too, watching, listening, reminding himself that he still had reasons to show up. The meeting was supposed to be informal, a tour, a short conversation with Dr. Lionel Hayes, a senior research engineer. But the path to the lab took them past a small, open workshop metal shelves stacked with wheelchairs in varying states of disrepair. One was flipped on its side, a broken axle exposed. Mateo slowed, eyes locked on the gap near the wheel casing. His fingers twitched slightly. "Do you think it's all right if I—" He glanced at Gregory, unsure. "Can I try?" Hayes raised a brow. "Be my guest." Marco stepped up next to him, pulling a small multi-tool from his jacket. "We used to fix busted carts behind grocery stores," he said. "Scrap metal, busted frames. Old parts we could make one working unit out of 3 broken ones. In 20 minutes, they had the chair upright and working." Mateo had diagnosed the fracture pattern in the metal, and Marco had adjusted the balance by modifying the tension in the left side wheel. Hayes crouched beside them, watching in silence, then stood slowly. "How old are you two?" 15, Marco said. Hayes nodded, almost to himself. "I have graduate students who'd need a week to see that." Gregory didn't say a word. He only watched, his hands behind his back, fingers clenched lightly. The sunlight caught in the corner of his eyes, and for a moment, it wasn't just the wind that made them glisten. Back at the house, Elijah was hunched over the living room table, colored pencils scattered like spilled candy. A half-done sketch lay in front of him, Gregory, drawn in profile, wearing a hospital gown. It wasn't childish. It was precise. The liver was sketched faintly beneath the shirt's outline. When Gregory walked in, Elijah jolted and tried to slide the paper away. "You don't have to hide that," Gregory said, voice even. Elijah didn't answer at first. Then he mumbled, "I just wanted to get the shape right." Gregory stepped closer. "You got it right. Mom had liver cancer, stage 4. Nobody caught it until it was too late." Gregory sat beside him. "How long ago?" 3 years. They didn't speak for a while. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound. Then Elijah said, "She used to tell me, if you want to fix something, you better learn how it works first." Gregory nodded slowly. "That's good advice." Later that night, when the house had gone still and the boys had retreated to their rooms, Gregory returned to his study. He didn't turn on the lamp, just sat in the leather chair by the window, eyes drifting over the skyline. The truth was, none of this had been in his plan. He had expected to feel a sense of control-curated charity, structured outcomes. But these kids didn't work that way. They didn't just receive. They challenged, observed, responded. They forced him to see things he hadn't looked at in decades. On his desk, neatly folded, was a sheet of paper that hadn't been there before. The handwriting was small, deliberate. "Noah's," it said, "Mr. Caldwell. I've been reading your test results. I have an idea, but I'll need a new blood sample. I know that's not how it usually works, but maybe usual isn't good enough." Noah Gregory held the note for a long time. Then he reached for the phone. He didn't dial, not yet, but his hand stayed on the receiver, like he might. The basement had once been storage space. Concrete walls, low ceilings, dusty corners where time seemed to settle like sediment, but over the last few days, it had transformed. Marco had wired the lights to stop flickering. Mateo rigged ventilation to push air without noise. Elijah hung a map of the human body over a corkboard where pushpins marked diagnosis trails. And in the middle of it all, Noah stood behind a fold-out table, next to a small refrigerated unit and a whiteboard scribbled with enzyme diagrams. Gregory sat across from him, sleeves rolled up, skin pale under the overhead bulbs. There was no doctor, no sterile gown, just a 10-year-old boy holding a Lancet pen and a confidence most adults couldn't fake. "You don't have to do this if you're not comfortable," Noah said softly, not out of fear, but principle. Gregory met his eyes. "You think it might work?" Noah didn't blink. "I think it hasn't been tried, and sometimes that's the only difference between failure and a start." Gregory held out his hand. The prick was quick. Noah caught the sample, labeled it precisely, then moved to a small centrifuge he'd calibrated that morning. In the corner, Jaden watched silently. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that Gregory trusted the kid, or the fact that the kid sounded more certain than any adult he'd known. Upstairs, in the den, Mateo clicked through lines of code, sitting cross-legged on the rug. Marco leaned over his shoulder, fingers moving quickly between the keyboard and a notepad full of equations. "It's not just prediction," Marco said. "It's correction. If we feed the system a confidence threshold for ethics, not just return, it'll self-moderate volatile trades." Jaden looked up. "That's not just a filter. That's reprogramming the company's brain." Mateo shrugged. "You said it needed one." They presented the prototype to Gregory that evening, right after dinner. He listened, arms crossed, and asked 3 questions, 2 technical, 1 philosophical. Then he leaned back in the chair. "Submit it." Jaden raised a brow. "They'll shoot it down in 5 seconds. Then we give them 6. Gregory smirked. "Call it a sandbox test. Run it with 1 portfolio. If it breaks, no one dies. Except the old model." Jaden murmured. Gregory nodded. "Some models deserve to." The test results arrived the next afternoon. Noah brought the envelope upstairs, clutched like it might dissolve if he loosened his grip. Gregory opened it quietly. Inside was a summary: numbers, abbreviations, ratios. But the key was a red pen mark From the lab presence of CYP4V2 variant. Treatment protocol mismatch likely. Consider targeted enzyme therapy. He read it twice, then handed it to Noah. Noah looked at it, frowned, and then grinned. That's the one I thought. Gregory sat down in the kitchen with a long exhale. He didn't speak for several minutes. That night, for the first time since the diagnosis, he joined the boys for dinner, not standing in the doorway, not hovering with a coffee cup. He sat down, plate in hand, napkin in his lap, letting Elijah argue about hot sauce, and Mateo tease Noah about being a mad scientist in pajamas. Jaden watched from across the table. The man who had once walked past them like they were statistics was now laughing, quietly, with his head tilted back just slightly. A man learning again how to be part of something. As they cleared plates, Jaden leaned over and asked, "What happens if your real doctors say Noah's wrong?" Gregory glanced at Noah, who was licking peanut butter from a spoon. "Then they'll have to catch up." Outside the dining room, Celeste stood in the hallway. She'd retrieved the test results while Gregory was upstairs. She hadn't made a sound. Now, in her office, the paper lay flat on her desk. She took a photo with her phone clean, precise. Then she attached it to a draft message already written. Confirmed. The message read, "Data is valid. Start the plan." She clicked send, then turned off the light. She didn't close the door, but something in the air felt like it had just been sealed. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, Chicago, shimmered with the kind of wealth that never had to explain itself. Velvet chairs, crystal glasses, every plate touched by flame-seared perfection. But at the center of it all, a long, polished table glowed under the recessed lighting, and around it, the future of Caldwell Capital was being discussed like a chessboard no one wanted to admit was already in play. Gregory sat at the head, posture still erect despite the fatigue beneath his skin. His breath was slower lately, but he refused the cane offered that morning. Beside him, Celeste Monroe read from a sleek tablet, her voice calm, every detail measured to the second. Q4 return delta 3.2% above projection. Community-led fund diversion saw a 9% increase in engagement. She didn't glance at him as she spoke, but every word was tailored, timed, controlled. Preston Vale sat diagonally across, arms folded, a thin smile playing under his tailored jawline. He spoke little, but his eyes moved constantly at Jaden in the corner, at Marco sketching something on a napkin, at Noah asleep against Elijah's shoulder. His smile never reached his eyes. When the meeting ended, the guests began to rise. Some lingered to shake hands, others offered hollow promises and clipped pleasantries. Gregory stood, shifting his weight subtly. As he moved toward an investor waiting near the fireplace, Mateo followed him at a distance, wide-eyed but quiet. He'd been sketching most of the session, half distracted, half curious. When he leaned down to pick up his notepad, something on Celeste's phone caught his attention. She had placed it face up for a moment. The lock screen blinked on. It wasn't a photo or a quote. It was the logo of Veil Investments. Mateo froze, the pencil slipping from his hand. His stomach tightened in the way it always had when Foster Holmes turned. He didn't speak, didn't react. He just tore a small square from the edge of his notebook and scribbled one line in tiny letters. He slipped it to Jaden as they left the ballroom. Jaden unfolded the paper slowly. Don't trust anyone. That night, the house felt colder, even with the heat on. Gregory was in his study, reading an old proposal Jaden had updated for the ethics-led AI portfolio. His fingers lingered on one of the margins, where Jaden had annotated in red pen, "Conscience is cheaper than litigation." He almost smiled. Celeste entered without knocking. She held a folder, but she didn't hand it over. "You need to start thinking about someone who can replace you." He looked up slowly. "In what capacity?" he asked. "As the head of the company," she said. "And the house." Gregory didn't blink. "Are you speaking as my assistant, or someone else?" Celeste didn't answer. She placed the folder on the desk and turned to leave. The silence she left behind filled the room like a fog. Outside, the air was thick with January wind. On the side terrace near the ballroom loading dock, Preston leaned against a stone pillar, black coat folded neatly over his arm. Celeste approached, not hurried, not hiding. He handed her a small USB drive, black, unlabeled. "Phase 1 is done," he said. "What's next?" He smiled, and this one chilled even the concrete, end the legacy, and end the orphans with it. She didn't respond right away, but she didn't hand the USB back either. The streetlight above flickered once, then stayed lit. The Chicago Art Institute gleamed like a monument to permanence. Inside the grand rotunda, walls were hung with curated expressions of vision and wealth. Spotlights cut through the dusky air like quiet expectations. A string quartet played something meant to soothe, but it only reminded Jaden of waiting rooms and whispered conversations behind frosted glass. They arrived not in a limousine, but in Gregory's old black sedan because it was still faster through traffic, he said. Noah had his tie on backward. Elijah wore sleeves too long, hiding the faint raised line that had once been a scab that never properly healed. Marco and Matteo clung close, unsure whether to smile or disappear. As they stepped into the ballroom, the murmurs began, not loud, but precise. Is this the new marketing strategy? I thought he'd bring a date, not an exhibit. Bless him. He must be lonelier than we thought. A journalist from the Tribune leaned in, voice like velvet laced with vinegar. Is this philanthropy, Mr. Caldwell? Or are you auditioning for sainthood? Gregory said nothing, but his eyes darkened slightly, enough for Jaden to feel the shift beside him. They didn't belong, not in tuxedos or even pressed shoes. That was the message in every glance. They weren't children here. They were cautionary tales given a tux. At the far end of the exhibit, Elijah lingered near a bronze sculpture of a figure crouched under a spotlight. A man in a designer suit passed behind him, murmuring under breath. Who let the street rats in? Elijah didn't react. He just adjusted his sleeves, tugging them over his wrists with practiced instinct. Don't, Jaden said gently, walking up beside him. You don't need to disappear just because they don't understand. Elijah looked at him, wide eyes, bright but quiet. They don't even see us. Gregory had been speaking to a cluster of investors, holding a glass of water like it was part of his hand. But he caught the edge of Jaden's glance and walked over. We're not part of your portfolio, Jaden said. Low. We're not here to make you look good. You never were, Gregory replied. And if anyone here thinks that, they're not worth speaking to. Before Jaden could respond, Marco whispered from behind a pillar. She took a picture of us, he said. Who a woman, blonde, red jacket. But her name wasn't on the press list at the entrance. Gregory turned, scanning the crowd. The woman was already gone. Back at the table, Matteo found a card, white, clean, folded once. It hadn't been there when they left. Jaden opened it. Inside was one sentence, typed. He knew who you were before you stepped into his house. It wasn't signed. For the rest of the evening, the music kept playing. But the notes fell dull. Back in their rooms later that night, Jaden sat on the floor, card in hand. Matteo was pacing. Noah was quiet. Gregory hadn't come up from his office. Jaden didn't say much. He folded the card again and tucked it beneath his mattress. But before the light went out, he murmured, What if they're right? No one answered, but the silence was heavier than sleep. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Even the birds seemed to hesitate before landing on the edge of the wide terrace outside the Caldwell estate. In the dining room, the silverware clinked gently against porcelain, but no one was really eating. Elijah pushed eggs around his plate. Marco and Matteo traded glances across their juice glasses. Noah, for once, didn't hum his usual morning tune. Jaden had been awake long before sunrise. The light from his laptop cast a pale blue glow on his face, making his jawline look sharper, his eyes more hollow. He had spent the entire night sifting through old downloads, bits of data he'd salvaged years ago from the failing servers of the group home that used to be his whole world. It wasn't easy. The files were messy, the formatting broken. But one document stood out. It had his old case number at the top. Below that, a scanned proposal, a funding request from the home to the Caldwell Trust Initiative. year 2017, category education and rehabilitation, and then the stamp, rejected. Below it, a line in black ink, handwritten, not a viable long-term investment. No name, just initials. G. C. Jaden didn't cry. He didn't even blink for a long while. Then he printed the document, folded it once, slid it into a worn manila folder. At breakfast, he didn't touch his food. He waited until Gregory poured his second cup of coffee. Then he stood up, walked around the table, and placed the folder next to the sugar bowl. Gregory looked up. Jaden didn't flinch. "Do you remember this?" he asked. Gregory opened the folder. Read the first few lines. His hand didn't shake, but something in his face did. He opened his mouth to speak. Jaden held up a hand. "You don't need to explain. I already did it for you last night. Market volatility, lack of oversight, minimal projected ROI. But here's the thing. My life wasn't a spreadsheet. The room was still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop." Gregory looked across the table, not at Jaden, but at the other children. Then back again. "I was wrong," he said softly. Jaden nodded. "Maybe, but you didn't just reject a file. Mr. Caldwell, you rejected me, before you even knew my name." Gregory started to rise, but Jaden stepped back. "I need air," he said. "I'll be back when I figure out whether I'm here because you wanted redemption or because you couldn't face dying without fixing your own guilt." Noah dropped his spoon. Mateo whispered something, barely audible. Gregory stood frozen, one hand still on the folder. The words on the paper felt heavier now than the diagnosis tucked into his drawer. As Jaden turned to leave, Elijah started to rise too, but stopped midway. No one knew what to say. Jaden paused at the door. "You didn't just walk past us back then," he said. "You walked through us." And then he was gone, outside. The wind pulled at the edges of his jacket. A few leaves skittered across the driveway like they were trying to flee too. Back in the dining room, Gregory looked down at the rejection stamp. This time, he read it slower. Not a viable long-term investment. He didn't move for a long time. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked closed. The morning sun spilled across the mahogany desk in Gregory's study, but it didn't warm the room. He sat perfectly still, the old rejection form from Caldwell Initiative in his hand. The ink had faded, but the weight of those words hadn't. Not a viable long-term investment. He stared at the phrase like it belonged to someone else, like a different version of himself had written it, one colder, more removed, buried in spreadsheets and numbers. He didn't call his lawyers, didn't loop in his board. Instead, he reached for the landline, a gesture that felt strangely intimate. It rang twice before a receptionist picked up at the Brookline Group home, where Jaden once slept on a cot next to a broken window for 2 winters. He didn't give his name, just said, "I'd like to contribute to the educational program." Quietly, fully, under something like the Self-Starter Fund. The woman on the line paused, then softly replied, I think that would help a lot of kids." He hung up without another word. Then he walked out of his study, left the house alone, and took the long drive south toward Marquette Park. The address wasn't new to him. Years ago, his firm had acquired a group of houses in this neighborhood during a foreclosure sweep. One of those homes had belonged to Elijah's mother. She worked the overnight shift at a laundromat now. When Gregory walked in, she looked up, unsure whether to speak. He didn't introduce himself, just handed over a thin folder with paid hospital invoices bills dating back 4 years, marked resolved. Then he placed a sealed envelope on the counter, nodded, and left. He never looked back. There were no photos, no handshakes, no stories for the press. Just a quiet echo in the air after the door closed, and a woman who stood staring at the envelope like it might vanish if she blinked. That same afternoon, Jaden sat alone on a bench at Lincoln Park, hood pulled low over his brow. The city breathed behind him, children shrieking in the distance, dogs barking, a saxophone player warming up on the corner. His phone vibrated. It was a text from his mother. There was an old man today. He didn't say sorry, just handed me something, said it was what you should have had all along. Jaden reread it twice, then slowly opened his inbox. An auto-forwarded message had just come in from Brookline. Confirmed scholarship funds received. New program begins fall. For kids like you. He looked up at the sky. Not blue, not gray, just somewhere in between. Like someone trying to figure out which version of themselves they were willing to be that day. Meanwhile, in the heart of downtown. Celeste stood at a copy machine in an unused floor of Caldwell Capitol. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the latest printout, a blood panel from Gregory's recent testing. This one didn't match the last. Too clean. Too hopeful. She opened her phone and dialed. Preston answered on the first ring. "They're close," she said. "The kids, the data, everything. We have to move, or we lose it all." Preston's voice came low, steady. "Then we don't wait anymore." She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for a folder labeled Legacy Transition Plan and began replacing pages, one by one. Outside the window, the sky shifted again, and the saxophone down the block finally found its tune. The conference room at Caldwell Capitol had never been this quiet, not with executives in tailored suits, not with polished glass walls reflecting sterile confidence. But today, the stillness came from something different. It came from 5 kids standing in front of people who usually looked past them. Gregory stood at the head of the table. Behind him, a digital projection displaying Caldwell Index, reimagined by youth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence, once a storm of control, now carried a kind of weight that was quieter, but heavier. "These 5, he said, eyes pausing briefly on each child, have done more in 6 weeks than most of us dared to do in 6 years. Jaden, in particular, has rebuilt something we once buried out of fear it wouldn't yield immediate results. Caldwell Index is his now." The room shifted. Heads turned. Jaden stepped forward. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't smile. "I grew up thinking I was invisible. That data like mine got filed under not worth the risk," he said. "But I was wrong. Not because someone changed the system, but because someone gave me the tools to stand above it." He paused, then looked straight at Gregory. "I'm still learning what that means, but I won't forget it." Polite applause followed, some hesitant, some genuine. But it wasn't for show. It was for the fact that a boy who used to steal lunch from vending machines now talked about ethics and finance like he belonged in the room. After the meeting, most of the crowd trickled out, but Gregory stayed behind. He waited by the window, the late afternoon sun washing over the floor. When Jaden finally walked over, he didn't sit. He leaned against the chair opposite Gregory, arms crossed, eyes guarded. Gregory didn't flinch. "When I was your age," he said, "I made the mistake of believing silence was safer. My father, he ran this company before me, the original Caldwell Index. It was his, and it was supposed to help kids like you. But when budget cuts came, he axed it. I fought him. Not loud enough. I was just another name in the room back then." Jaden didn't respond. Gregory looked down at his own hands. They were shaking slightly subtle. "But there, you think I'm trying to fix things to make myself feel better? Maybe you're right. Maybe I am. But this isn't about redemption. It's about refusing to pass the damage down another generation." There was silence. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC, steady and cold. Then Jaden spoke, voice low. "You ever hate someone so long that when they're finally gone, you don't know what to do with yourself?" Gregory looked up, surprised. Jaden continued. "My father left before I knew him. My mother, she tried, but she wasn't enough. And when I saw that signature on the rejection letter, it felt like all of you were the same." He swallowed, looked away, then back again. "But today, I saw a different man." Gregory nodded once. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." "Good," Jaden said, "because I haven't." He turned and walked toward the elevator, but just before the doors closed, he looked back over his shoulder. "I'm not ready to forget, either." but I'll remember what you did today. And this time, Gregory didn't reply. He just stood there, letting the quiet speak for him. The warehouse at South Side had once stored rusted engines, crates of forgotten parts, and the kind of silence that wrapped around lives left behind. Now, it smelled of fresh paint, wood shavings, and something rarer beginnings. Gregory stood just inside the door, letting the wind from the open windows move past his coat. The walls, once cracked and damp, had been patched and painted in soft grays and greens. The place didn't pretend to be modern. It breathed warmth, not polish. That was the point. They'd named it the lift room. It wasn't his name. Elijah had suggested it. It doesn't have to sound fancy, the boy had said. Just has to feel like somewhere people rise. Inside, the space was humming with quiet focus. One side of the room held a modest library and 2 rows of used laptops, cleaned and reprogrammed by Marco and Matteo. Elijah sat at the back near the whiteboard, showing a group of middle school kids how to draw rib cages with shadows instead of lines. One girl with a birthmark under her eye kept copying his hand position. When he noticed, he didn't say anything. He just slowed down his strokes for her to follow. In the corner, Noah adjusted a touchscreen terminal with oversized fonts and audio options. He tapped a blue button that made a calm voice read aloud, "Feeling unwell. Tap here to learn what it might be." Another line scrolled below, "No appointment needed. Just show up." Outside the entrance, Matteo and Marco were crouched on the sidewalk, fixing a boy's broken tablet with tools they used to hide under piles of cardboard back when streetlights were their ceiling. "Give us 10 minutes, Matteo said. Maybe less, if Marco stops showing off. The boy didn't laugh, but he smiled, just a little. Jaden walked through it all like he was watching something unfold beyond himself. He wasn't checking progress. He wasn't commanding anything. He was present, and that, for someone who'd spent years detached, was something new. Gregory stayed by the wall, never once stepping forward. Reporters had come, of course. They always did when the word redemption hung in the air. But there were no speeches today, no ribbon cutting, just a place built by kids who once were statistics, now offering a map for others not to end up the same. One reporter, a woman in a tan blazer and worn heels, cornered Jaden gently. "You're the lead on this project. Yes, tell me why now?" Jaden didn't deflect. He just looked around the room at Elijah, at Noah, at the walls they'd painted themselves and said, "Because we used to be the ones nobody thought about. Now we think about them." The woman didn't write that down. She just looked at him, eyes soft. Later that day, as the sun tilted and shadows climbed the brick walls, a small girl tugged on Elijah's sleeve. She was 12, maybe younger, with fingers stained from the cheap marker sets in the art corner. She held up a drawing of a heart, not the symbol, the organ, and whispered, "Can I learn to draw like you?" Elijah blinked fast. He didn't say yes or no. He crouched down and handed her his pencil. Gregory saw it from across the room. He didn't smile, but his hand, clenched most of the afternoon, finally eased. That night, long after the kids left and lights dimmed, Celeste typed an email from her personal laptop, subject line transition. In the message, she formally submitted her resignation, citing the need to make space for newer leadership. She didn't CC anyone. She didn't mention the file on her desk, one detailing the internal vote to grant decision-making authority over a set of experimental investment algorithms to 5 underage advisors. Preston received it first. He opened the attachment, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't smile. He stared at the screen, then clicked open another message, shorter, unsigned. "They're not just staying, they're taking the wheel." The conference room was bathed in the dull light of a Chicago afternoon, humming with the low murmur of business minds trying to predict an uncertain future. Gregory sat at the long table, flanked by Marco, Matteo, and Jaden, each of them immersed in the latest iteration of the Caldwell Forecast AI. This algorithm was their beacon amid the shadows of looming economic downturns. Designed to anticipate crisis cycles by analyzing shifts in consumer behavior, a tool meant to change the game for investors and communities alike. Gregory's eyes, though focused on the spreadsheets and coding displays, held a different kind of weight today. It wasn't just the numbers or the algorithms that occupied him, it was the kids, these young souls who had carved out a space in his life and, slowly, in his heart. Midway through the meeting, as the group discussed data streams and predictive models, a sudden commotion at the doorway broke the rhythm. A boy, no more than 7, clad in a worn jacket and dusty sneakers, burst into the room, eyes wide and searching. He hurried toward Gregory with an urgency that silenced the room. "Dad," the boy called out, his voice cracking with the innocence and need that comes from a child desperate for connection. The room froze. No one said a word, not even to correct the boy. The weight of that one word, Dad, hung in the air like a fragile thread, delicate yet unbreakable. Gregory's posture shifted. He allowed the moment to settle before he gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement without words, no explanation, no distancing, just presence. For a fleeting second, the walls of business, science, and past mistakes dissolved. It was just a man and a child, connected by something deeper than blood. After the meeting adjourned, Matteo nudged Gregory as they gathered their things. "You know," he whispered, "we don't stay here because of you. We stay because of what we're building together." Gregory nodded, the lines around his eyes softening with a mix of exhaustion and hope. Across town, in the shadows of a high-rise office, Preston watched the footage from a live stream, a security camera angle that had captured the entire scene. His hands clenched into fists, jaw tight. "If we don't bring this empire down," he muttered to Celeste beside him, "there won't be any way up for us." Celeste's gaze was cold, calculating. "Then we act fast, before they become unstoppable." Meanwhile, back in the heart of the warehouse that had become their sanctuary, Jaden lingered in a quiet corner. The boy's mind raced with questions and a fragile hope. For so long, he had thought of himself as an outsider, a pawn in someone else's game. But moments like these, moments where the past and present collided in the most human of ways, began to reshape his understanding of family and trust. That night, Gregory sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. He reached for a worn photo on his desk, the one with all 5 kids, smiles wide and eyes bright, taken months ago when the warehouse first opened. His fingers traced the edges, and in that silent act, a promise formed, not for recognition, not for forgiveness, but for the chance to build something real, something lasting. He whispered into the empty room, "This is just the beginning." The boardroom of Caldwell Capital was filled with a tense energy that could be cut with a knife. Gregory stood firm, his voice steady but resolute as he outlined his bold proposal to transfer 30% of the company's profit shares into a social fund, managed by the children he had taken under his wing. It was a radical shift, a gamble to rewrite the future of a company built on tradition and conservative wealth. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The room responded not with applause, but with murmurs of disbelief and rising opposition. One board member, a man whose gray hair and stern face had seen many battles, finally spoke up. "You want to hand the future of this company over to children with no formal education," he said, his tone laced with scorn and fear. "What have your degrees done for you?" "What do you know that they don't?" Gregory met his gaze evenly. "If your degrees had built a better world, we wouldn't be here having this conversation." The room erupted, voices raised, arguments flared, and the question of tradition versus transformation took center stage. The board was divided, many unwilling to embrace change, clinging instead to the familiar safety of their status quo. Before the scheduled vote could begin, the atmosphere shattered with a new shock. Preston, Gregory's relentless adversary, strode in, holding a document he had seized from Celeste's office. The paper displayed a chilling simulation, an apocalyptic total loss scenario that sent ripples of panic through the shareholders. Gregory's chairmanship was immediately suspended, the board citing the need for an investigation. The once steady foundation beneath him began to crumble, shaken by fear and deception. Celeste sat quietly in the corner, her head bowed, a mixture of regret and resolve in her eyes. When pressed during the inquiry, she spoke softly. I believed in him once, but he changed the rules so fast. There was no place for someone like me in the new game. Her words stung with the weight of betrayal, a fracture between allies born of shifting ambitions and unforgiving realities. Jaden stood at the forefront of the next hearing, a calm contrast to the turmoil swirling around him. He held a detailed report in his hands, a thorough refutation of Preston's fabricated evidence, built from countless hours of research and truth-seeking. This document, Jaden began, voice steady despite the room's heavy silence, exposes the falsehoods designed to dismantle what we've worked so hard to build. Yet, even with his meticulous defense, the tide was slow to turn. The board wavered, caught between disbelief and the shadows cast by fear. The report alone was not enough to restore Gregory's position, but Jaden's eyes searched the room, landing on a small figure waiting in the back, the living proof of all they were fighting for. Without that, even truth seemed fragile. Gregory, sitting quietly outside the courtroom, felt the sting of isolation deepen. He had always known that change would come with resistance, but this was more than he anticipated. He was not just battling shareholders. He was fighting the ghosts of a past that refused to let go. Outside, a cold wind swept through the streets of Chicago. Gregory looked up at the gray sky and whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The vast hall of McCormick Place buzzed with anticipation, the annual shareholders' meeting in full swing. Faces both familiar and wary filled the room. Preston strode confidently onto the stage, eyes scanning the crowd with a calculated ease. He wielded the power of accusation like a sword, ready to dismantle the fragile coalition Gregory had built. "The new investment system," Preston began, voice sharp and steady, "run by a group of unqualified children, has shattered the trust in Caldwell Capital. Our shareholders' confidence is at an all-time low. How can we entrust our future to those without the pedigree or credentials to understand the stakes?" A murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of agreement and doubt. Preston clicked a remote, intending to display his damning evidence, a presentation illustrating the supposed failures and volatility caused by the children's AI project. But then, unexpectedly, the screen flickered and went dark. A collective gasp echoed in the hall. The silence that followed was pregnant, the kind that makes every heartbeat thunder. Then, without warning, the screen reignited, not with Preston's slides, but with a live feed from the AI system managed by Marco, Mateo, and Jaden. The data streamed in vivid detail, predictive models charting market behavior with uncanny accuracy, forecasting 92% of market shifts over the past 6 weeks. The algorithms, honed by these young minds from the South Side, had outperformed every corporate model Caldwell Capital had relied on for the last decade. Whispers turned into stunned exclamations. Faces shifted, disbelief clashing with awe. Gregory rose from his seat, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "They haven't walked the hallowed halls of Harvard or Yale," he said quietly, "but they've walked these streets, and from those steps, I found new life, new hope." Preston's face tightened, the mask slipping. His game was laid bare, the manipulation of data, internal corruption, and a ruthless scheme to seize control by bribing Celeste, his once loyal ally. The scandal spread through the room like wildfire, extinguishing the shadows of doubt. The board swiftly moved. Gregory was reinstated as CEO, his suspension revoked. Moreover, a revolutionary step was taken. The children were appointed to the company's long-term strategy committee, recognized not only as wards, but as invaluable contributors. As the room erupted into cautious applause, Noah hurried up the steps, clutching a sealed envelope. "Doctor's orders," he said breathlessly. "The new treatment is working. Gregory's health is stabilizing." Gregory's eyes, misted with gratitude and exhaustion, swept over the faces of the 5 children who had become his family. His voice cracked, but his words rang true. "If I have a few more years, it won't be because of medicine. It'll be because these kids refuse to let me fade away." The crowd fell silent, the weight of those words settling deep in every heart. A year had quietly passed, a season of slow but meaningful growth. The Caldwell Innovation Fund had officially opened its doors in the heart of Southside Chicago, a neighborhood once dismissed and overlooked, now humming with fresh life. Buildings that had long been forgotten were transformed, walls no longer cracked and lifeless, but vibrant with murals painted by local youth, classrooms filled with eager learners, and spaces designed not only to teach, but to heal. The once abandoned warehouse had become a sanctuary. The library opened wide its doors, shelves lined with books donated by supporters and curated carefully to reflect stories that often went unheard. The technology classrooms buzzed with the hum of computers, coding lessons led by Matteo and Marco, who had learned not only the language of machines, but the language of patience and encouragement. Elijah's design studio breathed with color and imagination, a place where sketches of hopes and dreams took shape. In a small medical office on the corner, Elijah had expanded his role, working alongside volunteer doctors to bring health care to those who had too long been ignored. On the day of the grand opening, the crowd gathered beneath a large white tent pitched in a clearing between the buildings. Gregory stood at the center of the stage, surrounded by the 5 children who had grown not just in stature, but in spirit. Each now led a branch of the foundation: Jaden, overseeing scholarship programs, Marco managing technology outreach, Matteo coordinating community events, Noah handling communications, and Elijah in charge of creative arts and health services. Gregory's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a journey far beyond financial success or corporate triumph. "I once was a man with everything but without purpose," he began. "Today, I don't search for a legacy engraved on stone. I've found family." The crowd, many of whom had once doubted or dismissed this endeavor, now rose together, their applause ringing out with renewed respect. A little girl near the front held high a painting simple but striking, a depiction of an elderly man in a worn suit, hands holding 5 children's, walking through a cityscape that looked less gray and more alive. In a small gallery space nearby, Noah quietly placed a folded letter onto a wooden pedestal. It was an old manuscript, a draft penned by Gregory's late father, long buried beneath years of neglect and misunderstanding. The line that caught Noah's breath, and soon Gregory's eyes as they scanned the words, read, "To do what is right. One must believe in what no one else dares to try." Gregory's gaze lingered on the paper, moisture gathering at the corners of his eyes. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement that echoed deeper than any speech ever could. No one spoke. No grand finale was declared. But as the crowd slowly dispersed into the afternoon light, a quiet understanding settled among them all. A new generation had risen, born not from blood, but from shared struggles, from moments of pain and healing intertwined. They didn't need to be the same to stand together. They only needed to look forward, in the same direction. The evening light settled softly over the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows that stretched like unspoken stories between the streets. In that stillness, the weight of what had been carried seemed a little lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because someone had dared to try. Trust, like the fading light, flickered uncertain but persistent, reminding us that change often begins in the small moments we almost overlook. The lines between broken and whole blurred gently, leaving space for something fragile yet real to take root. And as the night whispered its familiar lullaby, one question lingered quietly in the air. How do we learn to hold on when letting go feels easier?